So let's put some practical application to this whole Neo-Indigenous perspective that we've been talking about. Years ago, when I was a kid, and my dad was that small town high desert undertaker, we had a call where south of town, there, kind of up on the foothills, there was a single wide trailer that had this atrocious polka dot paint job all over it. It had certainly seen better days, and it was the Polka Dot Agate Ranch. And I had driven by it a number of times. I didn't actually know that there was anything going on there, but somebody who thought they were coming by as a tourist thought they would stop in and see whether or not there were actually polka dot agates to buy. Stopped and found the proprietor of that agate ranch dead on the floor, and he'd been dead there for quite a little while. And it was a bit of a mess. No one in the local community really knew anything about this guy. We figured that this would be quite the quick little government-supported funeral, and that would be the end of it. But come to find out, actually, he had a very large family, and a fair number of people that really cared about him a great deal, which was surprising. And it wasn't long before getting into the records that, of course, the Undertaker gets to see, that we found out what the story was. And this fellow had been a bombardier at the last of World War II, and he had flown that night when the Allied forces decided to bomb Dresden. Well, you know the historic story of that. And he had spent all night glued to the gun sights of the bomber, dropping bombs on that then really helpless population. He came home from the war and moved out into the desert and never talked to anybody ever again. Now, it has become in the popular self-help, I suppose, arena, quite prominent to talk about the role of trauma in one's life and how it shapes all sorts of subconscious structures that then will obviously precondition, at the very least, your choices as you move through life, and how understanding traumatic experiences and finding ways of processing those instinctive feelings that cannot help but arise in you when you are subjected to traumatic experience. Doing that is just essential to having health in your ability to relate either internally or externally. I think one of the places that, at least in the popular media, there's not such a good job being discussed, probably because it would just be unpopular, is that certainly having traumatic things happen to you will create a state of some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, obviously, or something of that nature. Being the victim of trauma obviously does that. But it's worth considering, and there's tremendous literature here too, and anybody that's around veterans knows all about it. There's tremendous trauma that one will become afflicted from if one is the perpetrator of trauma too. And I would suggest that in a lot of ways, overcoming the trauma from being victimized is probably easier than overcoming the trauma that you will subject yourself to by being the victimizer. It'll take a much deeper inquiry, and there'll be a lot more to work through when that source of the trauma is not a random externality, let's say, but it's you. That's a dark black box that very few people have the courage to open up and paw through. And it's something that would be really important, and it's very pertinent to our conversation to think about. So, of course, this all harkens back to the conversation we just had, where I'm asking the rhetorical question of whether you can take your monster suit off, whether or not you can come home from work doing something exploitive and ratty and predatory, and then come home and face your family with a completely different persona, right? I mean, some people do manage being schizoid like that reasonably well. I mean, I would go so far to say that if you look at our culture through this lens that I'm offering here, much of our culture looks like an attempt to be schizoid and compartmentalize and disassociated in the face of what is a very traumatic and predatory way of living, right? There's another aspect to this that should be thought about as well, and that's this. I know that I would encounter people who right now would say, well, it just doesn't bother me that much when I see, I don't know, a forest clear cut to chop down a pile of trees to make toilet paper out of or something, or some other kind of run-of-the-mill atrocity like we see daily in the news. That's just like, I just can't be bothered to think about that too much. People will say that, but it's important to understand that that's not where the trauma gets a hold of you. It gets a hold of you through a much deeper set of mechanisms, through things that lie much more akin to the instinctual than they do the cognitive. And you do have a genomic identity that carries 40 million years of human existence, that has its own eyes and ears, and it sees things every day that would terrify that mind. Whether you consciously acknowledge that exposure to trauma or not simply really comes down to how disassociated you are, not whether you care or not, or whether you're healthy or not. It comes down to whether you're fractured or not. The sense of how much the ubiquitous exploitive nature of our civilization is. Now, I'm sure, and I say this in the most open-hearted manner that I can, that some of you who would have not rage quit listening to this already are close to rage quitting when you hear what I'm saying, because it's probably making you upset for reasons that you don't really understand. Because, like, what is it that I'm advocating here other than to say, if you value your own life and you value the circumstances that make your life possible, there's a cascade of values that come from that that's very different than the values that our culture at large expresses. You would prioritize other things. Like, what in that statement is something that would upset anybody? But I know that people are upset by this. And you know what that is? It's a trauma response. It is allowing the pain that you instinctively feel when you see 2,000-pound bombs dropped using your taxpayer dollars on a absolutely helpless, poor as hell, oppressed human population, and the complete apathy in the community of peers that you might inhabit, if not monstrous exaltation when that kind of thing happens. Look, like, who would not be traumatized by this? Now, you can repress that trauma all you want, but when somebody makes it obvious and in a completely authentic, humane manner says, hey, you know, this bothers me, that forces you to contemplate whether or not it bothers you too. And whether it bothers you or not is more a matter of your heritage as a living human being than whatever crap you've been fed through the control mechanisms of an exploitive culture. Like or not, your genome is still human. Now, you can paper monster all over the top of it. You can pretend it doesn't bother you, but I can tell it does. Look, our entire culture is absolutely desperately dispossessed. Like, when you look at the kinds of mental health crises that people face, they're all about relationships and lack of value and lack of purpose. They are. This is classic post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Like, that's the case. And if you are either caught up by being injured by this exploitive culture, or you are caught up by being an exploiter within the culture, and in either way, you have a monster suit on. And when you get home, you lack the ability to take it off. Like or not, I don't see any other way to escape it. People like to claim that this is a product of human nature. That's just simply counterfactual. If human beings were as predatory as they are in the modern civilizational model, human beings would be extinct. There is no way that for the primitive man who has lived for the last 40 million years in the manner that human beings did, that they would ever have survived if cooperation hadn't been a primary value. If empathy and the ability to relate objectively to the external world hadn't been primary, you would have not survived a week. That's still the case. It's only because of the bubble of disassociation that is necessary within the culture that we live in that we think the way we do and we feel the way we do. But the cost to ourselves and our relationships, and ultimately with the entire biosphere that supports our very existence, the cost is going to be immensely high. This is the bed we've made for ourselves. So my approach here is relentlessly rational. It has to be, because all of us have lost, at least to some degree, our emotional connection to reality. And the only inflection point that I have in making this case is going to come from the rational mind. Because we are, generally speaking, as a culture, too disassociated from reality. To find any traction in making appeals to, what would be a natural reaction to the savagery of the environment that we inhabit. I have to make this in a rational sense, and I have to hope that we are intelligent enough to follow through and to learn something from a rational presentation of what seems to me to be pretty self-evident. Like the assertion number one, first principle is, I value my own existence. Now you can yes or no that. I'm not going to argue with you, but if your answer to that is I don't value my own existence, your next question is why, and are you happy with that? And I would suggest that you probably have critical issues that you ought to be thinking about, so that your current existence doesn't end up in complete disaster. But let's say you pass that and you can say in the affirmative, yeah, I value my opportunity to exist. And I hit you with proposition 2. It's like, well, if you value your opportunity to be alive, you should be objectively aware that there are mechanisms, systems, prerequisites that must be present, or you won't get the opportunity to exist, or at least not for long. And often these things are not things that you currently value. Okay? They're not your pickup truck, that's for sure. You know, they're not real estate, that's for sure. You know, they're not in your stock portfolio, that's for sure. But most people I know have a more powerful emotive connection to their pickup truck or to their stock portfolio or to abstractions like that than they do to having access to clean drinking water and the ability to express yourself as a human being. Like, isn't it worth reflecting on how screwed up that is? And how it is that you found yourself in a position where you literally love paper tickets more than living things? Can we not understand how, like, bent that is? I don't know that it's necessarily any of our fault. I guess it becomes our fault if we persist with it, having been shown another way. The other way is to reaffirm, again, your alliances away from these things that you've been taught to care about towards things that you must care about. I think if one just does that step by step, the solution presents itself. Now, another objection here that is too amplified within our culture just because of the money dynamics involved in it is going to be the text bro response to this. And they're going to accuse me of being anti-technology, right? Let me be clear, I'm not a Luddite. Okay, like my view on technology is probably pretty close to that being set by Buckminster Fuller, and a belief in the principle of ephemeralization, meaning that it's possible, at least if one is conscious, to create technology that enhances the ability of life to evade the entropic collapse curve rather than kinds of technology that accelerate it. Okay? Maybe that's a mouthful. But technology can be used that operates in such a manner that it accelerates and supports the life process rather than exploits it. So no, I am not anti-technology, but one must put technology in the service of life rather than the other way around. And very often we do it the other way around. And really, the tech bro guys that advocate for this stuff aren't very thoughtful anyway. They aren't really so much advocates for technology as much as expansionism, because civilization is a project that is not sustainable. It outruns its land base and ultimately collapses. And they understand that. They're at least that smart. So that they have to find the ability, if that means techne, to expand their sphere of exploitation indefinitely, or their whole house of cards collapses, just like it has always collapsed. So, like, I mean, there is, I suppose, a shared understanding there, but there's a very large disconnect between values there. There's an interesting quote from Toynbee, another expert on the collapse of civilizations and why they always collapse. And that interesting quote is that civilizations don't die from really. I'm paraphrasing here. That's been a long time. Civilizations basically commit suicide, is his claim. Now, that is a phrase that I hear from a lot of people, including all sorts of people that are all caught up in, say like the rabid anti-woke, or they're the Jordan Peterson types, or I mean, there's a million people out there making a pile of money talking about how civilization is collapsing, and they often, I guess, are humane enough to understand that, at least intuitively, they understand that, yeah, civilizations often do commit suicide. But what they don't get is the why. Right? I can tell you why the suicide rate is so high among veterans. Just ask a veteran if you want to know. Like, if you have the experience of your existence being involved in something truly horrific, like the bombing of Dresden, or, I don't know, just go on and on and on. If your existence has been predicated by something like that, the natural disassociation that you're going to be forced to feel by that little bit of you that remains human and you can't help but be. You're going to spend so much of your life, inwardly, outwardly, or at the cultural level, grasping for something that makes life meaningful. But you probably will ultimately fail. And I would say that I think it's likely and probably insightful to expect that civilizations are likely to commit suicide in the same manner that people who have done horrible things are likely to commit suicide. For those of us that have been caught up in that project against our will, we might have the opportunity yet to preserve our own humanity, and whatever we might do in a very practical, visceral manner that matters to our genome. Real stuff. Do whatever we can to step away from supporting a mechanism that objectively is destroying everything we love. I know that's tough talk, guys, but I hope it's helpful.